Plants, lesson 7.2, plant structure and function. So in this lesson, we're going to be talking about all the different parts of the plant and then each of those different structures function. So in order for plants to survive, they need nutrients and they need to be able to move those nutrients to every single cell in the plant. The roots absorb minerals and water from the soil, and then special transport vessels, which we'll learn about soon, conduct minerals and waters from the roots to the leaves and the stems. So, parts of a plant. So, first off, we're going to start with the roots. So, they're below the ground, they anchor the plant in the soil, and they absorb, just like we said, the water and the minerals and transport them to the stem. And then they also participate in a little bit of food storage. We then have the shoot, which is above ground, and then it leads to the stem and the leaves. So the shoot system is sort of that green part up there, and then the root system is the brown part. In the shoot system, we have the leaf, which is the main location of photosynthesis, and then the stem, which supports those leaves. It transports water, minerals, and sugar to and from the leaves, and some stems store food. It just depends on the plant. And then, of course, some plants have the flower or the fruit, and then the flower obviously is the reproduction, which we will talk about in another lesson, and then the fruit protects the seed. Speaking of seeds, we are going to talk about angiosperms. So angiosperms, remember that we have the two subclasses. So we have the monocots and the dicots, if you remember from Unit 1. So this is a sort of chart that maybe you could be asked for on a test, so it's a good chart to just remember the monocots versus dicots charts. So monocots are grains and grasses. They have only one cotyledon or a seed leaf. So for example, corn. Flower parts are in multiples of 3. Narrow leaves with parallel veins are what their leaves look like, and they have a fibrous root, which we'll talk about soon. Then dicots have 2 cotyledons, and then, so for example, a daisy, tomato, or maple tree, flower parts in multiples of 4 or 5 compared to the monocots, which have 3. They have very broad leaves, branching veins, and then they have something called taproots. So now this brings us to a little bit of the seed structures. So the main components of a seed are the seed coat, the embryo, and then the endosperm. So you can kind of see those parts in the seed there. And then we talked a little bit about germination last time, which is essentially the process of how a seed grows. All angiosperms, so remember we talked about in the last class with monocots and dicots, so flowering plants have at least one seed leaf. Next, we can talk about the different root types. So, like I said before, remember taproots are dicots and fibrous roots are monocots. So taproots are primary root. The primary root emerges from the germinating seed. It develops into a long, thick taproot, which is kind of like a if you think of like your tap water, like a tap, like it's hollow inside, and then branch roots, which are the secondary roots, emerge as it grows. Fibrous roots, which are many main roots, thousands of secondary and tertiary roots, extend roots over a wide area. So like kind of the roots that you think about, like they're super, super skinny and long, and they stretch for like, you just keep pulling them out and pulling them out, pulling them out. It seems like they're never ending. And then some of the roots or prop roots grow out of each other. So they're the basic structure of the plant. Next, we have the root tissues, which are essentially just like we as humans have tissues, roots have tissues too. So this is both for fibrous roots and for taproots. They both have essentially the same root tissues. So the epidermis is the outermost layer, and it protects the inner layer. It absorbs water and minerals, and specialized cells form root hairs, which you can see on the edge of that diagram there, and they increase the surface area, just like in our stomach. The little hair-like extensions in our in the digestive system and our digestive tract increase the surface area. Same with rouage. Then we have the cortex, which are the cells that store things like starch, which is very important for a plant, and they help transport water from epidermis to the center of the root. And then the endodermis is the specialized wax-coated layer, and some plants like cacti have a better wax-coated layer just because where they live in the world. And then they have the Casparian strip, which surrounds the endodermal cells, so that sort of part around. And the Casparian strip surrounds the endodermal cells, and it prevents water from moving around them. Water must move through the endodermal cells into the vascular cylinder by osmosis, and we'll learn a little bit about osmosis later, but essentially it's a form of transport of water. Minerals are pumped through by active transport, and it controls movement of water and minerals into the vascular cylinder. We have two types of stems in plants. So we have the herbaceous and the woody. So the herbaceous are typically green, usually soft, and they don't usually survive the winter, but they regrow every year. So there's that sort of disadvantage there. So, and then we have woody, which is what you would basically picturing a woody stem, and it's essentially a piece of wood or like a stick, and it contains tough, hard tissues. It will be able to survive the winter, not considering the fact that it may fall down because of snow or wind, and then it's often things like trees, like lilac, shrubs, etc. Woody stems, we also have to remember that all trees have a woody stem, and the major components are the cork, phloem, vascular cambium, sapwood, and heartwood. And then woody stems are able to grow thicker over time. So that's why some stems are really, really thick and they have all those sort of rings around it, and then some of the baby ones are really skinny. This now brings us to vascular bundles, which are a collection of xylem and phloem and associated tissues. So xylem and phloem are a super, super important part of plants, and we're going to hear a lot about them in the plant unit. So xylem is always closer to the center of the stem, and it essentially carries water and minerals up from the stem. Phloem is closer to the outside of the stem, and it carries sugars down from the leaves. And we'll talk a lot more about them later, but that's essentially what they do. Vascular bundles surrounded by supporting tissues, and this is a very important part. Maybe you want to add to your monocots versus dicots chart, and that vascular bundles are scattered in monocots and arranged in a ring in dicots. And this is just a little bit about what they look like. So xylem, you can see the water and minerals being transported, and it sort of has that tube sort of look to it. And then we have phloem, which has sort of a two-way movement, and it's sort of a more closed off version of the xylem, and obviously more skinny it looks like as well. We then are going to move to parts of a leaf. So for the leaf, we have what is called the cuticle, we have the epidermis, the stomata, and then the mesophyll. So the cuticle is a waxy substance produced by the epidermis, and it covers the leaf. The epidermis forms an outer cell layer of the plant, with cuticle provides waterproofing for the leaf, protective barrier for tissues inside the leaf, but water, oxygen, carbon dioxide must move in and out of the leaf, so the epidermis must still allow for that. Then we move into what is known as the stomata. So the stomata is the passage of gases that the stomata is where the passage of gases happens. So just like in our lungs, where passage of gases happen, it's like that. Most are located on the underside of the leaf, and carbon dioxide from atmosphere is used in photosynthesis. In general, the stomata is open during the day to allow CO2 in and H2O vapor out. Oxygen is also released into the atmosphere through an open stomata. It's usually closed at night to prevent water loss, and you can see in things like cactus and stuff that would be very beneficial to them. The stomata can be closed during the day, but it depends on the plant. And then each stomata is surrounded by two guard cells. So the guard cells in the stomata are a super, super important part, and we're going to talk about that in a second. So the guard cells in the daylight have complex movement of ions into guard cells that create a hypertonic environment inside the cells. So water moves in as a result of them causing to swell. So when the water moves in the daylight, it causes those little little thin parts to swell, and it creates an opening when it swells. So that's an open stomata. And then because the inner wall of the guard cell is thicker than the rest of the cell wall, the cell curves more onto its outer side, and then it makes that sort of opening. The uneven curving of the guard cells causes them to pull away from each other and open the stomata. And then at night, the opposite occurs. So then the water sort of moves out, and then it contracts and it closes that opening in the middle there. Next, in the leaf, we're still talking about the leaf structure. So we've already talked about the cuticle, the epidermis, and then the stomata, and now that brings us to the palisade and spongy layer. So the palisade layer is a more densely packed layer, and it usually contains more chloroplast than the spongy cells. And remember, the chloroplast is the substance that makes the plants green. Then we have the spongy layer, which is loosely packed. Air can be in contact with these cells. All cells covered in a thin film of water and oxygen and carbon dioxide to be dissolved. Water transported by xylem here, and over 90% of the water entering the roots of plants evaporates from the surface of the mesophyll cells. Transpiration also occurs here, and we'll talk about transpiration in the next slide, but essentially it's the process of water loss through evaporation in leaves. So transpiration is the process of water movement through a plant and its evaporation from its aerial parts. And aerial parts consist of things like leaves, stems, and flowers. And water is a necessary part for plants, but only in small amounts of water taken up by the roots is used for actual growth and metabolism. So we can see that transpiration is a very important part to plant. And that's essentially all of the parts of the plant, the main parts of the plant. There's lots of little parts of the plants that are unique to different types of plants, but those are essentially the main parts and their main function. And we'll talk a lot more about things like xylem, phloem, osmosis, transpiration in the next few lessons as well. And that's it.